Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back, over 3,000 years, to a time and place that feels both incredibly familiar from movies and textbooks, and utterly alien in its reality. Imagine the dry, hot air hitting your face, thick with the smell of dust and something else, maybe damp earth mixed with livestock. The sun beats down relentlessly, brighter and harsher than you're used to, reflecting off pale sand and the distant, shimmering surface of a mighty river. Around you, structures rise not of concrete and steel, but of sun-baked mud brick, weathered and simple. People move about, dressed in linen, their skin tanned dark by generations under this powerful sun. This isn't a museum exhibit. This is life, raw and unfiltered. And honestly, you, with your soft hands, germophobia, and reliance on climate control and instant information, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, you've arrived. 1 minute you are scrolling through TikTok, the next you're blinking the dust out of your eyes in what appears to be a bustling, ancient village on the edge of cultivated fields. The first thing you notice, after the heat, is the sheer noise. Not the mechanical hum of modern life, but the braying of donkeys, the bleating of sheep or goats, human voices calling out in a language you don't understand, the rhythmic thud of tools, maybe even the distant sound of a drum. It's a symphony of analog existence. You look down at yourself, oh dear, still in your modern clothes. Not exactly blending in. Someone points, others stare. You feel exposed, vulnerable. This isn't just a historical theme park, this is the real deal, and you're completely unprepared. The world around you is defined by the Nile. You can see it now, a wide, brown ribbon snaking through the landscape. This isn't just a river, it's the lifeblood, the highway, the calendar, and the god of this civilization. Without its annual inundation, the land wouldn't be fertile, crops wouldn't grow, and everyone would starve. It's the most critical mainstream historical fact you need to grasp immediately. Ancient Egypt is the gift of the Nile, as the Greek historian Herodotus famously put it centuries later. Everything you see, everything people do, is tied to this river's cycle. You might think, okay, river, got it. Like the Mississippi or the Amazon. No. This river is the economy, the transportation, the agriculture, and even the religion, all rolled into one muddy, sacred package. You try to get your bearings. The air smells earthy, but also organic. Very organic. Animal waste is just around. There are no paved roads, just dusty paths worn smooth by feet and hooves over millennia. People carry burdens on their heads, donkeys are laden with goods, and simple wooden boats ply the waterways. The buildings are low, mostly 1 or 2 stories, made of those mud bricks you saw. They look sturdy enough, but maybe a bit crumbly? No gleaming structures here for the common folk. You see people working in the fields, bent double under the sun, using tools that look incredibly simple by modern standards, wooden plows pulled by oxen, sickles for harvesting grain. The pace of life feels slow, dictated by the sun's arc and the demands of the fields, but also intensely physical. You might spot something that seems a little odd to your modern eyes. Maybe someone is wearing a cone of what looks like fat on their head. That's probably scented fat, meant to melt and release perfume throughout the day. A quirky tidbit that might make you wrinkle your nose, imagining melted animal fat dripping down your neck in this heat. Yeah, maybe skip that fashion trend. Or perhaps you see children running around, maybe playing with rudimentary toys, but also clearly expected to help with chores from a young age. Childhood as you know it, a protected time of learning and play, might not exist here in the same way. Trying to communicate is impossible. You speak English, they speak, well, ancient Egyptian. A language with hieroglyphs carved into temples, but spoken in dialects that are long gone. You can't ask for help, can't ask where to find water, can't even ask what that strange smell is, you probably don't want to know anyway. This immediate language barrier is a survival challenge you probably hadn't considered. You're mute and deaf in a world where understanding is everything. And speaking of understanding, you quickly realize that the way people think about the world is fundamentally different. Their understanding of science, medicine, the cosmos, and their place within it is governed by a complex web of religious beliefs, superstitions, and practical knowledge passed down through generations. There's no concept of germs, no understanding of gravity in a scientific sense, no knowledge of other continents far across the ocean. Their world is centered on the Nile Valley, bordered by the vast, dangerous desert, and populated by powerful, sometimes capricious, gods. You might try to figure out who's in charge. You see people deferring to others, maybe someone dressed slightly better, or someone giving orders in the fields. Society isn't flat, it's a steep pyramid, with the pharaoh at the very top, seen as a living god or divine representative, and then layers of priests, nobles, scribes, soldiers, craftsmen, farmers, and laborers below. Finding your place, or even understanding where you fit in this rigid structure, is going to be a challenge. Are you seen as a foreigner? A vagrant? A potential slave? Your status is unknown, and in a society with strict rules, that's a dangerous position to be in. Consider your modern skills. Can you read hieroglyphs? Can you navigate by the stars or the flow of the Nile? Do you know how to cultivate emmer wheat or barley? Can you build a structure out of mud brick? Can you treat a wound with honey and linen? Unless your hobbies include extreme historical reenactment and wilderness survival, probably not. Your ability to code, drive a car, or order food online is utterly useless here. You are, effectively, helpless. There's also the simple fact of time. Ancient Egypt wasn't just one static period. It spanned over 3,000 years, with different dynasties, capitals, and cultural shifts. When exactly have you landed? Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom? The daily life, the political structure, the gods emphasized, it all changed. Historians still argue whether the lives of commoners changed dramatically over these long periods or remained relatively stable, tied to the unchanging cycle of the Nile and the demands of agriculture. This isn't a single snapshot in time, but a vast, complex tapestry, and you've just been dropped into one thread of it. The sun continues its relentless march across the sky. You're already feeling the heat, the thirst, the discomfort. You long for a cold drink, a shower, maybe just a clean place to sit down. You look around at the people who live here, who are living here, day in and day out. They seem resilient, adapted, perhaps even content in their way. They know the rules, they know the rhythms, they know how to survive. You realize with a sinking feeling that you know none of those things. This isn't a vacation, it's a test you're almost certainly going to fail. The journey has just begun, and already, the odds are stacked against you. Okay, you're standing there, feeling utterly out of place, the language a wall, the sights and sounds overwhelming. The sun is climbing higher, and that initial discomfort is quickly turning into real thirst and hunger. Where do you even go? Where do you sleep? Nobody is offering you a room key or pointing you towards the nearest Airbnb. You're just there. Eventually, perhaps you're noticed by someone who takes pity on you, or maybe you're just directed towards the common area of a village, the place where most people live. Your first glimpse of your potential, humble abode, is probably a bit of a shock. Forget spacious layouts, private bathrooms, or even windows with glass. Most homes for ordinary Egyptians, the farmers, the laborers, the lower-level craftsmen, were built from sun-baked mud bricks, often mixed with straw. These bricks were strong enough to build multi-story structures, but the walls were thick, the doorways low and narrow to help keep the heat out. Inside? Dark. And probably pretty cramped. A typical house might have just a few small rooms arranged around a central courtyard, which was the main hub of activity during the day. You might share this space with extended family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, because privacy as we know it wasn't really a concept. Imagine trying to find a quiet corner to doom scroll. Yeah, not happening. Furniture was minimal. Maybe some woven mats on the floor for sleeping, a few low stools, storage jars made of pottery for grain and water. There wouldn't be closets. Clothes were probably just stacked or hung on pegs. And remember air conditioning? Or even a fan? Nope. The thick mud walls helped insulate a bit, but the Egyptian heat is legendary, and you'd be living with it day in, day out. Cooking was often done in the courtyard or sometimes in a specific room with a clay oven or brazier, filling the small space with smoke. Sanitation? There weren't flushing toilets. Waste was collected and used as fertilizer, or maybe there was a simple latrine pit outside. The smells you noticed earlier? They're about to become very familiar. Living here is less about comfort and more about basic function and survival. Now about food. You're hungry, right? Forget popping into a corner store or ordering delivery. Getting food in ancient Egypt was a process, often a difficult one. The absolute staples of the diet were bread and beer. Not the craft beer you might enjoy, but a thick, often chunky brew made from fermented barley, which provided calories and hydration, and was safer to drink than plain water from the Nile sometimes. Bread was made from emmer wheat or barley, and let me tell you, grinding the grain by hand with a stone quern was backbreaking work, often done by women. The flour was coarse, containing grit from the stones, which is why archaeologists find so much tooth wear on ancient skeletons. Your modern, sensitive teeth would probably be aching after just a few meals. Mainstream historical fact alert: bread and beer were so fundamental that laborers were often paid partly in rations of both. Imagine getting your paycheck as a loaf of bread and a jug of lukewarm, gritty beer. Cheers! What else would you eat? Onions, garlic, and other vegetables like lettuce, lentils, and beans were common. Fruits like figs, dates, and grapes were available seasonally. Meat was a luxury for most people, maybe eaten on special occasions or festivals. Fish from the Nile was a more common source of protein, caught using nets or simple lines. You might also eat poultry like ducks or geese. Everything would be prepared using simple methods: baking, boiling, or roasting over an open fire. There were no refrigerators, obviously, so food had to be eaten relatively quickly or preserved by drying or salting. That leftover pizza you were planning to have for breakfast? Yeah, forget about it. Getting clean water is another hurdle. The Nile is right there, but it's a working river, full of silt, animal waste, and who knows what else. While they didn't understand germs, ancient Egyptians did practice some forms of water purification, like letting the silt settle or sometimes adding alum to clarify it. But you'd still be drinking water that would make your modern stomach churn. Coupled with the lack of sanitation, the constant presence of insects, flies, mosquitoes carrying diseases, and the heat, staying healthy is a monumental challenge. A quirky tidbit: some Egyptians apparently used a kind of primitive water filter made of pottery or cloth, but relying on that alone wouldn't protect you from everything lurking in the water. Think about the effort involved in just surviving. You need water, food, shelter, and warmth. At night it can get cool, even in Egypt. Every single one of these requires physical labor. Pumping water? No. Carrying it from the river in heavy jars. Grinding grain? Hours of work. Preparing food? Gathering fuel, tending the fire, cooking from scratch. Maintaining your mud brick house? Dealing with cracks or leaks. There's no convenience here. Your body, used to a life of relative ease, climate control, and readily available sustenance, would be under immense strain. You'd be constantly hot, tired, hungry, and thirsty. Historians still argue whether the nutritional status of the average Egyptian commoner was consistently good or fluctuated greatly depending on the success of the harvest and the political stability of the period. Some evidence suggests they were reasonably well nourished when things were good, but famine was a constant threat if the Nile didn't flood properly. So, your ability to find enough food and stay healthy would be heavily dependent on factors entirely outside your control: the river's whims and the state's ability to manage grain distribution. Imagine trying to sleep in that small, stuffy room on a hard mat, probably sharing the space with multiple family members, maybe even some livestock if it's cold. The air is thick with the smell of cooking smoke, sweat, and animals. Mosquitoes buzz around your head. The sounds of the village, maybe a dog barking, a baby crying, someone coughing, filter through the thin walls. This isn't the silent, temperature-controlled environment you're used to for sleep. Rest would be fitful and probably not very restorative. Remember that sleep tracker on your watch? It would probably just give up in despair. So, just finding a place to exist, finding something to eat and drink, and trying to get some rest are immediate, grinding challenges. Your soft hands would blister quickly, your stomach would rebel against the unfamiliar diet and water, and your body would struggle with the constant heat and physical exertion. You wouldn't just be uncomfortable, you'd be facing genuine survival threats from exposure, dehydration, malnutrition, and disease, all stemming from the fundamental differences in how daily life was lived. And you haven't even had to work yet. Okay, you've managed to find a place to lay your head, you've choked down some gritty bread and lukewarm beer, and you're starting to grasp the sheer physical effort required just to exist here. But simply surviving the heat and hunger is just the beginning of your problems. Your modern body, used to sterile environments, filtered water, and a pharmacy on every corner, is about to stage a full-scale protest. Get ready for aches, pains, and a medical system that makes your annual checkup feel like a trip to a spa. First off, you're going to get hurt. Your soft office worker hands? Ripped and blistered from manual labor you're not used to. Your back and knees? Aching constantly from hauling water jars, bending in fields, or carrying burdens. Sprains, strains, cuts, and bruises would be daily occurrences. And remember those mud brick buildings? They might crumble, causing injuries. Tools are simple and unforgiving. Just navigating the uneven, dusty paths is an ankle sprain waiting to happen. You're not just uncomfortable, you're physically vulnerable in a way you probably haven't experienced since childhood. And this time, there's no adult to kiss it better and slap on a cartoon band-aid. Beyond injuries, prepare for the onslaught of ancient diseases. That Nile water you're drinking, even if they tried to clarify it? It's teeming with things that would make your gut twist in knots. Parasites were rampant, things like schistosomiasis, bilharzia, carried by snails in the irrigation canals, would infect millions, causing chronic pain and organ damage. Dysentery and other diarrheal diseases from poor sanitation and contaminated food and water were common, especially among children. Your carefully balanced gut microbiome, cultivated with probiotics and mindful eating, is about to be utterly decimated. Good luck finding Imodium here. Then there are the environmental factors. The dust, the sun, and the flies are constant companions. Eye infections were incredibly common, often leading to blindness. Trachoma, spread by flies, was endemic. Imagine waking up every morning with your eyes crusted shut, surrounded by swarms of flies attracted by poor sanitation. Yeah, not exactly a refreshing start to the day. Skin infections were also frequent, thanks to cuts, insect bites, and the general lack of effective hygiene. So you're injured, you're sick, or both. What do you do? There weren't hospitals as we know them, but ancient Egyptians did have doctors, known as SWNW. Mainstream historical fact: ancient Egyptian medicine was remarkably advanced for its time, with physicians specializing in different areas like dentistry, gynecology, and even veterinary medicine. We know this from surviving medical papyri, like the Edwin Smith papyrus, which details surgical treatments for trauma in a very systematic way, or the Ebers papyrus, a vast compendium of remedies and magical spells. Seeking treatment might involve visiting a SWNW, or perhaps going to a temple, as priests often had medical knowledge and access to herbal remedies, sometimes blending medicine with religious belief and magic. The approach to illness wasn't purely scientific. It was a mix of practical observation, herbal lore, and attempts to appease angry gods or ward off evil spirits thought to cause sickness. Your doctor might examine you, feel your pulse, ask about your symptoms, and then prescribe something you find utterly baffling. Prepare yourself for the remedies. While they used many effective natural substances like honey, a natural antiseptic, willow bark, containing salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, and various herbs, they also incorporated some truly bizarre and frankly disgusting ingredients. Animal parts, excrement, yes, including human and animal dung, and other strange substances were common components of prescriptions, often mixed with beer, milk, or water. A quirky tidbit: The Ebers Papyrus includes remedies for everything from baldness, mixtures involving fats of lions, hippos, crocodiles, and cats, to guinea worm infections, applying hot poultices, to contraception, mixtures involving crocodile dung and sour milk. Imagine being told to apply a poultice of donkey dung to a wound. Your modern mind is screaming, infection risk! And honestly, it wouldn't be wrong. The concept of germs was millennia away. Diagnosis and prognosis could also be quite different. The Edwin Smith Papyrus shows a rational approach to trauma, classifying injuries and offering prognosis like, an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with. Or grimly, an ailment not to be treated. This shows a level of realistic assessment. But elsewhere, especially in the Ebers Papyrus, the prognosis might involve interpreting dreams or astrological signs. If you went in with a headache, you might get a poultice of herbs and instructions for a protective amulet, just in case. So, you're faced with doctors who have some genuine medical knowledge but also rely on treatments that involve animal dung and magic spells. You can't explain your symptoms accurately because of the language barrier. You don't trust the remedies, but what other choice do you have? Refuse treatment? Suffer in silence? Try to find clean water and hope your immune system, boosted by a lifetime of modern vaccinations and nutrition, can fight off ancient pathogens it's never encountered? Historians still argue whether the average Egyptian commoner had regular access to skilled medical care or if it was largely reserved for the elite. While papyri describe sophisticated procedures, these might have been performed more often in royal courts or major temples. For the average farmer or laborer in a remote village, healthcare might have been limited to local folk remedies, the help of a village elder, or the local wise woman who knew about herbs and spells. Your chances of seeing a highly trained SWNW might be slim to none. Even if you received the best ancient Egyptian care, recovery would be a slow, uncertain process without modern antibiotics, sterile equipment, or pain relief beyond perhaps opium or mandrake, if you were lucky. A simple infection could turn deadly. A broken bone might heal crookedly, leaving you with a permanent disability. Chronic parasitic infections would drain your energy and shorten your lifespan. Your body, accustomed to popping an ibuprofen for a headache or getting a quick prescription for a bacterial infection, would be utterly overwhelmed. The constant exposure to pathogens, the lack of effective sanitation, the physical demands of daily life, and the limited, sometimes questionable, medical interventions mean that getting sick or injured here isn't a temporary inconvenience. It's a major life-threatening event. You wouldn't just be uncomfortable, you'd be genuinely, terrifyingly vulnerable to the myriad ways the ancient world could break your body. Okay, you've survived the night, or at least you woke up still in one piece, probably aching from the hard ground and the unfamiliar smells. You've had your gritty bread and beer breakfast. Maybe your stomach is already staging a minor revolt from the water or the weird ingredients in the bread. You're sore, you're hot, and you're definitely not feeling 100%. But guess what? There's no calling in sick here. No sending a quick email saying you're working from home, because you have a case of the ancient Egyptian sniffles. Life here is dictated by the sun and the demands of survival, and that means you have to work. For the vast majority of people in ancient Egypt, life revolved around the land and the Nile. Mainstream historical fact: agriculture, centered around the Nile's flood cycle, was the foundation of the Egyptian economy and the primary occupation for most people. You're probably going to find yourself thrust into this world of farming. Forget riding a tractor or checking weather apps. Your tools are simple, made of wood, stone, and maybe a bit of copper or bronze if you're lucky. You'll be working the fields from sunup to sundown, your back bent, your hands raw. Imagine the scene: the relentless sun beating down, the air thick with dust from the dry ground or heavy with humidity after the flood. You're out there, maybe wading through mud left by the receding Nile, preparing the soil. Plowing is done with a simple wooden plow, often pulled by oxen, but guiding it through the heavy earth is hard, physical work. Sowing seeds involves walking the furrows, broadcasting grain by hand. Then comes the irrigation, channeling water from the Nile or canals to the fields, often done by hand with buckets on a yoke across your shoulders, or perhaps using a shaduf, a counterbalance lift that allows you to raise water from a lower level to a higher one. It's repetitive, back-breaking, soul-crushing labor, day after day, season after season. No ergonomic assessment here, just generations of doing it the hard way. When harvest time comes, you'll be swinging a sickle, cutting stalks of emmer wheat or barley under that same brutal sun. The grain has to be threshed to separate it from the stalks, often by driving animals over it, and then winnowed, tossing it in the air for the wind to blow the lighter chaff away from the heavier grain. This fills the air with dust and tiny bits of straw, irritating your lungs and eyes. Remember those eye infections we talked about? This kind of environment is a breeding ground for them. And the grain itself, once harvested, represents your food for the year, your payment, and the wealth of the landholder you're working for, often the state, a temple, or a wealthy noble. But farming wasn't the only labor. The state was constantly building massive temples, pyramids. Though the major pyramid building era was earlier than some periods you might land in, construction was ongoing, tombs, palaces, and canals. This required a massive workforce. A quirky tidbit, the system of state-organized labor, known as corvée, required citizens to work on public projects like pyramids, temples, or canals for a certain period each year, essentially a labor tax. This wasn't necessarily permanent slavery for everyone involved, but a compulsory duty owed to the pharaoh. If you were called up for corvée labor, your life would change dramatically. You might be housed in barracks with thousands of other workers, fed basic rations of bread, beer, and maybe some onions or fish. The work could be incredibly dangerous, quarrying heavy stone blocks, hauling them across vast distances, lifting them into place using ramps and sheer manpower. Imagine dragging a multi-ton stone block under the whipping of an overseer, surrounded by thousands of sweating, straining bodies, the air filled with dust and the rhythmic chants of the workers. Your modern gym routine would not prepare you for this kind of sustained, high-intensity physical exertion. Your PTO request would be met with blank stares, assuming you could even ask for it. Even if you weren't a farmer or a corvée laborer, daily life involved constant physical effort. Craftspeople, potters, weavers, metalworkers, carpenters, worked long hours using simple tools and manual power. Scribes and priests had more intellectual work, but even their lives were structured and demanding. There was no concept of a 40-hour work week, no weekends off to recover. Work started at dawn and finished at dusk, dictated by the sun. The rhythm of life was slow compared to our modern pace, but the physical demands were constant and intense. Historians still argue whether the conditions for these laborers, particularly those on state projects, were consistently harsh or varied depending on the period and specific project, with some evidence suggesting they were relatively well-fed and housed compared to other ancient labor forces. Some papyri and archaeological evidence from workers' villages like Deir el-Medina, home to the tomb builders, suggest a degree of organization, provision, and even labor disputes that hint at more than just brutal oppression. But even in the best-case scenario, it was still incredibly demanding physical labor under harsh environmental conditions. Your Fitbit would probably melt from the heat and the sheer number of steps and calories burned just existing. Think about the cumulative effect of this kind of work on your body. Constant strain, repetitive motions, exposure to dust and sun, inadequate rest, and a diet that, while perhaps sufficient in calories, might not provide all the micronutrients your modern body is used to. Injuries wouldn't just be painful, they could be career-ending, leaving you unable to support yourself or your family. There was no workers' compensation, no disability benefits. If you couldn't work, you relied on family, charity, or you simply starved. It was a brutal, unforgiving system where your value was often directly tied to your physical ability to contribute labor. You, with your desk job, your climate-controlled commute, and your concept of leisure time, would find this relentless, physical toil utterly exhausting and soul-crushing. Your body would break down quickly, your spirit would likely falter under the weight of the endless cycle of work and the lack of modern comforts or protections. The dream of seeing the pyramids up close quickly fades when you realize you might be one of the anonymous figures hauling the stones, not a tourist admiring them from a distance. The harsh reality of daily labor in ancient Egypt is a powerful reminder that survival here was a constant, physical struggle you are entirely unprepared for. So you're aching, probably covered in dust and sweat, maybe nursing a blister or two from trying to help out with the harvest. You're starting to realize that just the sheer physical grind of daily existence here is overwhelming your modern, cushioned body. But physical survival isn't the only challenge. You're not just dropped into a landscape, you're dropped into a society, a complex web of relationships, rules, and expectations that are utterly foreign to you. And let me tell you, navigating this social maze without a map, a translator, or any idea of the rules is perhaps even more terrifying than the prospect of manual labor or dysentery. You see people interacting, deferring to some, giving orders to others. There's a clear pecking order, a structure that determines everything from where you live, and what you eat to how you're treated and what your future, or lack thereof, might look like. Mainstream historical fact: ancient Egyptian society was highly stratified, often visualized as a pyramid with the pharaoh at the absolute apex, followed by a small elite of high priests, nobles, and viziers, then scribes, officials, and skilled craftsmen, and finally the vast base composed of farmers, laborers, and servants. There wasn't much room for movement between these layers, especially for those born into the lower ranks. Think of it less like a career ladder you can climb and more like being assigned a floor in a very tall, very secure building, with most of the elevators out of order. You, arriving with no family ties, no property, no known skills in their context, and speaking gibberish, are essentially an anomaly. You don't fit neatly into any of their established boxes. Are you a foreigner? They certainly look at you like one, with your weird clothes and bewildered expression. Are you a vagrant? Someone without a place or purpose? That's a dangerous label in a society built on order. Are you a potential slave? While large-scale chattel slavery wasn't as central to the economy as it was in some other ancient civilizations, people could be enslaved through capture and warfare, debt, or as punishment. Your undefined status makes you vulnerable to being slotted into the lowest rung, regardless of your modern notions of personal freedom. Trying to figure out who has authority is tricky without language. You might observe interactions, someone dressed in finer linen being bowed to, someone with a staff directing workers in the field. These are visual cues, but they don't tell you why they have power or how you should behave around them. In your world, you understand concepts like police officers, bosses, or elected officials. Here, authority might stem from birthright, religious position, administrative office, or even magical power attributed to them. Misunderstanding a social cue, failing to show proper respect to someone of higher status, or accidentally stepping into a forbidden area could have swift and unpleasant consequences, ranging from a beating to imprisonment, or worse. There's no HR department to file a complaint with, just the immediate, often harsh, reality of their justice system, which we'll get to later. Imagine trying to network in this environment. Hi, I'm your name, I have a background in digital marketing and I'm looking for opportunities. Yeah, that's not going to open any doors. Your resume, your LinkedIn profile, your carefully cultivated personal brand, utterly meaningless. Your value is based on your ability to perform necessary physical labor, your connection to established families or institutions, like a temple or a noble estate, or your mastery of specific skills that are needed, like being a scribe or a stonemason. If you don't have any of those, you're starting from less than zero. The concept of individual identity and personal ambition was likely very different too. While some individuals did rise through the ranks, often through literacy and service in the administration, for most people, your life path was largely determined by your birth. If your father was a farmer, you would likely be a farmer. If he was a potter, you would likely be a potter. There wasn't the expectation or even the possibility of constantly reinventing yourself or switching careers on a whim. Your role in society was often inherited, a destiny rather than a choice. This rigidity, while perhaps providing a sense of stability for those within it, offers no entry point for you, the outsider. A quirky tidbit: while social mobility was limited, literacy was one of the few pathways to a better life. Becoming a scribe, which required years of difficult training to master the complex hieroglyphic script, could elevate you into the administrative class, freeing you from manual labor and granting you status and privileges. Scribes were highly respected, exempt from manual corvée labor, and often served in important roles in government, temples, and the military. So, if you happen to secretly know ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs in cuneiform, just kidding, wrong civilization, you might have a tiny chance. Otherwise, better get used to the idea of backbreaking work. Historians still argue whether the extent of social mobility was truly as rigid as it appears from some sources, pointing to evidence of individuals from lower classes achieving higher status through exceptional service or talent, particularly during periods of political change. However, even these examples were likely the exception rather than the rule, and certainly not something you could count on achieving quickly or easily as a confused newcomer. The system was designed to maintain order and stability, reinforcing the existing power structures. Your modern sensibilities about equality, individual rights, and meritocracy would find no purchase here. The concept of a person's worth being inherent, rather than tied to their social position and utility to the state or elite, didn't exist in the same way. You are a cog in a much larger machine, and a very small, easily replaceable cog at that, unless you can prove otherwise. Your sense of self, shaped by a world that emphasizes personal achievement and self-expression, would be constantly challenged by a society that valued conformity, duty, and collective well-being, as defined by the elite, over individual desires. Even simple interactions are fraught with peril. Do you know the proper way to address someone of higher status? Do you know the specific customs and etiquette surrounding greetings, meals, or religious practices? Probably not. And your inability to communicate means you can't even ask for guidance without resorting to gestures, which could easily be misinterpreted. Imagine trying to navigate a formal dinner party, or a job interview where you don't speak the language and have no idea of the social rules. Now multiply that anxiety by 1,000, with the stakes being your basic survival and freedom. The sheer weight of the social hierarchy, the lack of a clear place for you within it, and the dangers of misunderstanding or offending those in power would add an immense layer of stress to your already precarious situation. You'd be constantly aware of your outsider status, your vulnerability, and the fact that your fate rests entirely on the whims of a system you don't understand and cannot easily influence. Finding your place here isn't just about getting a job or making friends. It's about finding a way to exist without being crushed by the rigid structure of ancient Egyptian society. You're starting to grasp just how deeply everything in this world is interconnected. The Nile, the labor, the social structure, your utter lack of belonging. And underpinning all of it, woven into the very fabric of daily life, is religion. Forget the idea of religion being something you just do on a specific day of the week, or a personal belief system you keep separate from your work or social life. In ancient Egypt, the gods were everywhere, influencing everything from the rising of the sun to the success of the harvest, from birth and death to the curing of illness. They were in the temples, yes, but also in the river, the animals, the sky, even in your own home. Your modern, often secular, mindset is going to be fundamentally at odds with this deeply spiritual reality. Imagine waking up and the first thing you think about isn't checking your phone, but acknowledging the sun god Ra as he makes his daily journey across the sky, bringing light and warmth. Every sunrise is a victory of cosmic order over chaos, and you are a tiny part of maintaining that balance. The world around you isn't governed by impersonal scientific laws, but by the will of powerful, often capricious, deities. The floods of the Nile aren't just a natural phenomenon. They are a gift from Hapi, the god of inundation. Sickness might not be a germ. It could be caused by an angry spirit or a god you've offended. Your very existence is dependent on the benevolence of these divine forces, and keeping them happy is paramount. The pantheon of Egyptian gods is vast and complex, with deities taking many forms, human, animal, or a combination. There's Ra, the sun god, Osiris, god of the afterlife, Isis, goddess of magic and motherhood, Horus, the falcon-headed god associated with kingship, Thoth, god of wisdom and riding, Batet, the cat goddess associated with home and protection, Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and the afterlife, The list goes on, with regional variations and changing prominence over time. Trying to keep track of them all, understand their relationships, and know which one to appeal to for which specific problem would be utterly overwhelming. You're used to maybe one or two major religious figures. Here, it's a cosmic bureaucracy. Mainstream historical fact: the pharaoh was not just a ruler, he was considered a divine being or the living embodiment of Horus, acting as the intermediary between the gods and humanity. His primary role was to maintain Ma'at, the concept of cosmic balance, truth, justice, and order. By performing rituals, building temples, and governing justly, in theory, the pharaoh ensured the gods were pleased, the Nile flooded, the crops grew, and the world didn't descend into chaos. This placed an immense religious significance on the state and its ruler, far beyond any modern political leader. You couldn't just complain about the pharaoh's policies. You were criticizing a living god. Your daily life would be punctuated by religious observance, whether you fully understood it or not. Simple acts like offering a small prayer or leaving a token offering at a local shrine before starting work would be common. Talismans and amulets depicting gods or sacred symbols would be worn for protection. Festivals dedicated to specific deities, often tied to the agricultural calendar or significant events, would involve processions, feasting, and rituals, providing rare breaks from the relentless work schedule. Imagine trying to participate in a festival you don't understand, surrounded by people chanting in a foreign language, performing actions whose meaning is completely lost on you. You'd feel even more like an alien observer. Temples were the centers of formal worship and religious power. They weren't like modern churches or mosques where the general public gathered for services. Ancient Egyptian temples were considered the homes of the gods, and access to the inner sanctuaries was restricted to priests and the pharaoh. The temple staff, including priests, scribes, and laborers, performed elaborate daily rituals to care for the cult statue of the god, clothing it, feeding it, symbolically, through offerings, and entertaining it with music and incense. Your only interaction with the major temples might be seeing their imposing walls from a distance, or perhaps participating in a public procession outside the main complex. The real religious work, the appeasement of the most powerful gods, was done behind closed doors by a select few. Becoming a priest wasn't necessarily a lifelong commitment for everyone. Some priests served for specific periods, rotating in from other professions. This system allowed a broader segment of the elite population to participate in the formal religious structure, gaining status and access to temple resources. However, the high priests of the major cults held immense power and influence, sometimes rivaling that of the pharaoh himself, especially during periods of weak central authority. Imagine trying to explain the concept of separation of church and state here. It simply wouldn't compute. Religious authority and state authority were inextricably linked. A quirky tidbit: many animals were considered sacred to specific deities and were revered, sometimes even mummified and buried in vast catacombs. Cats were associated with Batet, ibises and baboons with Thoth, crocodiles with Sobek, and so on. Harming a sacred animal, even accidentally, could have severe consequences. Imagine trying to navigate a village where certain animals roam freely and are treated with more respect than you are, and accidentally stepping on a sacred beetle could land you in serious trouble. Your modern instinct to shoo away a stray cat or dog would need to be suppressed very quickly. Historians still argue whether the average Egyptian commoner had a deep personal relationship with the major state gods or if their religious practice was more focused on local deities, household gods, and protective magic to deal with the immediate concerns of daily life, health, family, and a successful harvest. While the grand temples and state cults were certainly important, evidence from private tombs in Ostraca, pottery shards used for writing or drawing, suggests a vibrant popular religion involving personal prayers, offerings at small shrines, and belief in protective spirits and magic. You might find yourself relying less on the distant power of Ra or Osiris and more on a local god of fertility, or a protective amulet to ward off sickness. The concept of fate was deeply intertwined with religion. Events weren't random, they were part of the divine order, influenced by the gods. Bad luck could be a sign of divine displeasure, or the work of malevolent forces. This worldview could be comforting in providing explanations for hardship, but also terrifying, as it suggested you had little control over your own destiny beyond trying to stay in the God's good graces. Your modern belief in self-determination and shaping your own future clashes sharply with this ancient understanding of a world where your path is largely predetermined by cosmic forces. Navigating this religious landscape without understanding the language, the customs, or the complex web of divine relationships would be incredibly difficult. You wouldn't know who to pray to for help, what rituals to perform, or how to avoid accidentally offending a powerful deity or a sacred animal. Your lack of religious knowledge and your inability to participate in the communal rituals would further isolate you and mark you as an outsider, perhaps even a potential source of disruption to the all-important Ma'at. In ancient Egypt, religion wasn't optional. It was essential to the functioning of the universe and society, and your ignorance of it is another major strike against your survival prospects. You've spent some time, however brief, getting acquainted with the gods and the all-pervasive concept of Ma'at, that vital cosmic order that the pharaoh strives to maintain. But Ma'at isn't just about keeping the sun rising or the Nile flooding. It's also about justice, truth, and righteousness here on earth. And where there's order, there has to be law. Forget your modern legal system with its complex constitutions, endless appeals, and maybe a jury of your peers. Ancient Egyptian justice was a different beast entirely, one you are completely unprepared to face, especially as an outsider with no understanding of the rules. Imagine you've somehow managed to stumble into trouble. Maybe you accidentally took something that wasn't yours because you were starving, or perhaps you inadvertently wandered into a restricted area near a temple or noble's estate. In your world, this might mean a warning, a fine, or maybe a court date. Here, the consequences could be far more immediate and severe. The concept of law was deeply intertwined with Ma'at. Upholding the law was upholding cosmic order, and breaking it was introducing chaos. Not a great look for you, the already chaotic element in this structured society. Laws weren't codified into a single, comprehensive document like a modern legal code. They were based on tradition, royal decrees issued by the pharaoh, acting under the divine mandate to maintain Ma'at, and rulings made by judges in specific cases. The legal system aimed to settle disputes, punish wrongdoers, and ensure the smooth functioning of society and the state, particularly in matters of property, labor, and personal conduct. Cases could range from simple arguments over land or livestock to serious crimes like theft, assault, adultery, and even tomb robbery, a particularly heinous crime in a society obsessed with the afterlife. So, how would justice be administered? For common disputes or minor offenses in a village, you might be brought before a local council of elders or respected individuals, known as a kenbet. Mainstream historical fact: these local kenbet councils were common forums for resolving disputes among ordinary people, acting as both arbitrators and judges, trying to reach a consensus based on custom and fairness. This sounds almost democratic compared to what you might expect, right? A bit like a community mediation service, but with potentially much higher stakes. However, for more serious crimes or disputes involving significant property or higher status individuals, cases would go before higher courts, often presided over by scribes and officials, or even the vizier, who was the pharaoh's chief minister and held immense judicial power. Imagine standing before the vizier, essentially the second most powerful person in Egypt, trying to explain yourself while speaking an unknown language, accused of a crime you might not even realize you committed. Your chances of a fair hearing, based on your modern understanding of the term, are slim to none. Evidence might include witness testimony, who probably don't like the look of you, oaths sworn in the name of the gods, and sometimes even written documents, if you're lucky enough that your case involves something recorded by scribes. And then there were the punishments. Oh, the punishments. Forget community service or a short jail sentence. Ancient Egyptian justice could be brutal, reflecting the belief that restoring Ma'at often required harsh measures. Flogging was a common punishment for various offenses, administered publicly. Imagine the pain, the humiliation, the lasting physical damage, especially on a body already weakened by heat and labor. For repeated theft or more serious crimes, punishments could include mutilation, cutting off hands, feet, or noses. Think about that, your ability to work, to feed yourself, permanently removed. There were no prosthetics or disability benefits here. For the most serious crimes, like murder, treason, or the sacrilege of robbing a tomb, the punishment was often execution. This could take various forms, including beheading, impalement, or burning alive. A quirky tidbit: tomb robbery was considered such a grave offense, not just theft but a violation of the deceased's journey to the afterlife and an attack on cosmic order itself, that punishments were particularly severe, sometimes even extending to the families of the convicted robbers. Imagine facing execution not just for yourself, but knowing your family might suffer consequences too. Your modern concept of cruel and unusual punishment would be severely tested here. Even if you weren't executed or mutilated, imprisonment was a possibility, often involving forced labor in quarries, mines, or on state projects. Remember that backbreaking corvée labor we talked about? Now imagine doing it as a convicted criminal, under even harsher conditions and stricter overseers. There was no parole, no good behavior sentences in the modern sense. You served your time, often until you were no longer physically capable of working. Historians still argue whether the legal system was consistently applied across all social classes. While the ideal of Ma'at suggested justice for everyone, evidence from papyri and tomb inscriptions sometimes hints at preferential treatment for the wealthy and well-connected, and harsher penalties for the poor and enslaved. Were the local Kenbet councils truly impartial, or did they favor local elites? Was the vizier's court always fair, or could decisions be influenced by bribes or political pressure? It's likely that, as in many societies throughout history, the reality of justice didn't always live up to the lofty ideals. Your chances of navigating this system fairly, particularly as a vulnerable outsider, would be incredibly low. Could you appeal a decision? There was a concept of petitioning higher authorities, ultimately the pharaoh himself, but this was likely a rare and difficult process, probably only accessible to those with connections or resources. For the average person, and certainly for you, the judgment of the local court or official was likely final. There was no network of lawyers, no legal aid societies, no public defenders. You stood alone, your fate in the hands of people whose language you didn't speak and whose system you didn't understand. The constant threat of severe punishment for even minor infractions, coupled with your complete ignorance of the laws and social customs, makes navigating daily life a minefield. You wouldn't know what actions could lead to a beating, mutilation, or worse. Your modern freedom to speak your mind, question authority, within limits, or even just wander where you please is completely incompatible with this rigid, unforgiving system. One wrong step, one misinterpreted gesture, one act of desperation born of hunger or fear, and you could find yourself facing the harsh reality of ancient Egyptian justice, a reality far more terrifying than any legal drama you've watched on TV. Okay, so maybe you've managed to avoid offending the vizier or getting caught stealing a loaf of bread, though honestly, given your hunger and lack of resources, that seems unlikely. But even if you somehow navigate the treacherous waters of ancient Egyptian law and society, the natural world around you is a constant, lurking threat. Forget your carefully controlled modern environment. You are now living cheek by jowl with forces of nature that are powerful, indifferent, and often deadly. We've talked about the heat and the sun, those relentless forces that define daily life. You're constantly battling dehydration and sunstroke. Your skin, unused to this intensity, is probably already red and peeling. The dust gets everywhere, in your eyes, your mouth, your lungs. It settles on everything, a gritty reminder of the arid landscape that borders the fertile strip of the Nile. But the real dangers, the ones that can kill you quickly and violently, often come from the very source of life itself, the Nile River. You see that wide brown ribbon flowing majestically? It's beautiful, yes, the bringer of the flood and the sustainer of life. But it's also a highway for danger. The most infamous residents of the Nile are, of course, the crocodiles. Mainstream historical fact: Nile crocodiles were abundant and posed a very real threat to people and livestock who needed to access the river for water, washing, or travel. These aren't the relatively small, shy crocodiles you might see in some modern zoos. These are powerful, ancient predators, capable of taking down a full-grown adult. Imagine needing to fill a water jar at the riverbank, or crossing a shallow ford, constantly scanning the murky water for those telltale eyes or the ripple of a submerged body. Every trip to the river is a gamble, a moment of potential terror. Your fear of public swimming pools seems utterly quaint now, doesn't it? And the crocodiles weren't the only large, aggressive animals in the river. Hippopotamuses, while perhaps looking comical from a distance, are notoriously territorial and incredibly dangerous when provoked, especially mothers protecting their young. They could easily overturn a small boat or attack someone waiting near the shore. While perhaps less common in the immediate vicinity of densely populated villages in some periods, they were still very much a part of the Nile ecosystem and a significant threat to anyone traveling or working on the river. Trying to explain to a charging hippo that you're just a tourist who took a wrong turn is unlikely to go well. Beyond the large predators, the landscape is crawling with smaller, but equally deadly, creatures. Snakes are common, both in the fields and near human settlements. Cobra bites were a very real danger, as were the bites of vipers and other venomous species. Stepping carefully was essential, especially when working in tall grass or walking at night. Scorpions were another constant menace, hiding in cracks in mud bricks, under mats, or in piles of debris. Their stings are excruciatingly painful and can be fatal, particularly to children or those already weakened by illness. Imagine the constant anxiety of knowing that a single misplaced step or reaching into a dark corner could result in a life-threatening encounter. Your fear of spiders seems a little less intense now, right? And then there are the insects. We've already touched on the flies and mosquitoes in relation to disease, but it's worth emphasizing just how pervasive and annoying they would be. Swarms of flies constantly buzzing around, landing on food, on open wounds on your face. Mosquitoes, relentless in the evening and at night, carrying parasites like malaria and the vectors for those debilitating eye infections. There's no bug spray here, no screens on the windows, because there are barely any windows. You are simply living with the insect population, a constant, irritating, and dangerous presence. How did ancient Egyptians cope with these constant threats? They developed practical strategies, of course, avoiding dangerous parts of the river, being cautious where they stepped, perhaps using nets or fences to protect livestock. But they also relied heavily on religious belief and magic. A quirky tidbit: protective spells and amulets against snakes, scorpions, and crocodiles were very common. People would wear charms depicting protective deities like Bes, a dwarf god associated with protection against evil and danger, or Tauret, a hippopotamus goddess who protected pregnant women and childbirth. Ironically enough, they might recite incantations or leave offerings to appease dangerous animals or the spirits thought to inhabit them. You might find yourself clutching a small amulet, hoping it offers better protection than your entirely useless phone. Historians still argue whether the actual mortality rate from animal attacks and venomous bites was consistently high or if these dangers were more localized and seasonal, with people developing effective practical and magical defenses over time. While papyri and tomb paintings depict these dangers, the frequency and impact on the average person's life across different periods are debated. Were crocodile attacks a daily fear, or a rare but terrifying event? Was everyone constantly vigilant against snakes, or did they learn to live alongside them with minimal encounters? Beyond the immediate animal threats, the desert itself, bordering the fertile Nile Valley, was a dangerous place. While you're likely living in the valley, the desert represented the realm of chaos, populated by dangerous animals like jackals, hyenas, and perhaps even lions in some periods and regions, as well as bandits and hostile foreign groups. Getting lost in the desert meant almost certain death from dehydration and exposure. The comfortable, predictable world of the Nile Valley was always just a narrow strip, surrounded by vast, unforgiving wilderness. Think about trying to sleep at night. You're in a small, dark mud brick room, possibly sharing it with family and insects. You might hear the distant braying of donkeys, the sounds of the village settling down, but also potentially the unsettling calls of wild animals outside, a jackal howling in the distance, the rustling of something unseen near the house. The flimsy door offers little reassurance against anything determined to get in. Your sense of security, built on locked doors, alarm systems, and streetlights, is completely absent. You are exposed to the raw, untamed world in a way that is deeply unsettling. Every moment outside your immediate, crowded dwelling is a risk. Walking to the fields, fetching water, traveling to another village, you are navigating a landscape where natural dangers are a constant, palpable presence. You can't just call animal control, and your knowledge of first aid for snake bites is probably limited to what you saw in a movie once. The environmental threats in ancient Egypt aren't abstract concepts. They are living, breathing, slithering, biting realities that would quickly overwhelm your modern lack of preparedness and your expectation of a safe, predictable environment. Just surviving the wildlife would be a full-time job. So, you've somehow managed to avoid the vizier's wrath, dodge the crocodiles, and not step on a sacred beetle. You're still hot, dusty, aching, and probably hungry, but you made it through the day. Now, as the sun begins its descent, painting the sky in fiery hues, you might start thinking about, well, yourself. Your appearance, your comfort, maybe even trying to feel a little less like a walking dust bunny. You're used to a hot shower, clean clothes, maybe a little moisturizer. Get ready for a reality check, because looking your best in ancient Egypt was a whole different game, and hygiene wasn't just about smelling nice. It was often a matter of survival. Despite the dust, the flies, and the general lack of modern sanitation, ancient Egyptians placed a surprisingly high value on cleanliness and personal grooming. Compared to many other ancient cultures, they were remarkably fastidious. Mainstream historical fact: ancient Egyptians were known throughout the ancient world for their emphasis on personal hygiene, bathing regularly, and using various substances for cleaning and scenting the body. This wasn't just a luxury for the elite. Evidence suggests that even commoners made efforts to stay clean, probably out of necessity given the climate and the prevalence of disease. While you might assume ancient equals dirty, the Egyptians would probably find your modern habits, with all our chemicals and synthetic products, a bit bewildering, and perhaps even unhealthy. So, how did they get clean? Bathing was a regular practice. For those who lived near the Nile, a dip in the river was an option, though you'd need to be extremely careful of those aforementioned crocodiles and hippos. Probably not the relaxing soak you're used to. Wealthier homes might have a dedicated washroom area, often with a stone slab for standing and a drain, where servants would pour water over the person. For most people, it might involve simply using basins of water in the courtyard. And soap? Not the bars you're used to. They used a substance called natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture found in Egypt, which has cleansing properties. It could be mixed with oil to create a kind of paste for washing the body. Imagine scrubbing yourself down with salty, oily paste. Not exactly foaming body wash, is it? After washing, oils and perfumes were essential. The dry heat would quickly parch the skin, so rubbing in oils, often scented with flowers like lotus, jasmine, or lily, was crucial for keeping the skin supple and preventing it from cracking. These weren't just about smelling good. They helped protect the skin from the harsh sun and dry air. Remember those scented fat cones people wore on their heads? That was another way to release perfume throughout the day as the fat melted in the heat. A quirky tidbit: these fat cones, often depicted in tomb paintings, were likely made of animal fat mixed with resin and scent, designed to slowly melt and perfume the wig or hair below. While they look odd to us, they were a practical way to stay scented and perhaps even condition hair in the hot, dry climate. Try explaining that to your hairdresser. Yeah, just pop a scented animal fat cone on top, cheers. Clothing was simple and practical, primarily made of linen, a fabric derived from the flax plant. Linen is light, breathable, and ideal for the hot climate. Men typically wore kilts or loincloths, while women wore simple sheath dresses, often tied at the shoulder. Children often went naked, especially when young. Clothing was generally white or undyed, though the elite might have finely pleated garments, or wear more elaborate styles. Dyeing fabrics was possible but more expensive. Your elaborate modern wardrobe, with its synthetic fabrics, zippers, and multiple layers, would be completely impractical here. You'd overheat instantly. And laundry? Washing linen involved soaking it, beating it, and drying it in the sun. No washing machines or tumble dryers, obviously. Keeping your limited wardrobe clean would be another labor-intensive chore. Cosmetics were widely used by both men and women, and again, they weren't just for vanity. Eye makeup, particularly kohl, was incredibly important. Made from ground minerals like galena, kohl was applied around the eyes, creating that distinctive almond shape you see in Egyptian art. But it wasn't just decorative. It helped reduce glare from the sun and acted as a deterrent to flies, which were vectors for eye infections. It also had mild antibacterial properties. So, that dramatic eyeliner wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a form of health protection. Other cosmetics included rouge for the cheeks and lips, made from red ochre, and henna for coloring nails and hair. Your modern makeup bag, filled with synthetic pigments and long-wear formulas, seems a bit excessive when a lump of ground-up mineral does the job of protecting your eyes from the sun and flies. Hair and grooming were also significant. Shaving the head was common, particularly for men, as it helped with hygiene and keeping cool in the heat. Priests often shaved their entire bodies to maintain ritual purity. While some people wore their natural hair short or braided, wigs were very popular, especially for formal occasions or as protection from the sun after shaving. Wigs were made from human hair or plant fibers and could be elaborately styled. They were a sign of status and could be cleaned and restyled, perhaps offering better hygiene than trying to wash and manage long hair in a dusty environment. Facial hair trends varied over time. Pharaohs sometimes wore false beards as a symbol of divinity. Imagine the commitment to shave your head every day and then decide which wig to wear depending on your mood or the occasion. Your bad hair day existential dread seems manageable by comparison. Historians still argue whether the quality and availability of hygiene products and cosmetics were consistent across all social classes or if there was a significant difference between the elaborate routines of the elite and the more basic practices of commoners. While archaeological finds and texts show a wide array of grooming tools and cosmetic ingredients, the cost and accessibility of some of these items, particularly imported oils or finely crafted tools like bronze razors and mirrors, likely meant a simpler routine for most people compared to the pharaoh or high priests. Even with their focus on cleanliness, the reality of the environment meant constant exposure to dust, insects, and pathogens. Their methods, while advanced for the time, weren't foolproof. That salty natron soap doesn't kill germs like modern antibacterial wash. The kohl helps with flies but doesn't prevent all eye infections. The sweet-smelling oils might attract certain insects. You'd be making a significant effort just to maintain a basic level of cleanliness, an effort that would feel exhausting and perhaps ultimately insufficient compared to the standards you're used to. So, while ancient Egyptians valued personal care more than you might expect, the process was entirely different, more labor-intensive, and less effective by modern standards. Your idea of looking your best involves products and practices that simply don't exist here. You'd be battling the elements constantly, relying on ancient remedies and natural products, and probably never feeling truly clean by your own definition. The simple act of trying to maintain personal hygiene is another layer of daily struggle in a world that constantly challenges your modern expectations and vulnerabilities. Okay, you've scrubbed yourself down with salty natron paste, slathered on some scented oil to ward off the dry heat and perhaps some flies, maybe even tried that kohl eyeliner to protect your eyes, feeling very glamorous and slightly ridiculous, and you're wearing your simple, scratchy linen kilt or dress. You might feel slightly less like a walking dust cloud, but you're still acutely aware of the fundamental needs your modern life took for granted. And right now, after all that effort, you are hungry. Your stomach, used to the predictable availability of snacks and meals at any hour, is rumbling a loud, embarrassing protest. Getting clean was one thing, but now comes the even more fundamental challenge: finding something to eat and drink that won't immediately send you back to the questionable care of the ancient SWNW. Remember that gritty bread and lukewarm beer we touched on briefly when looking at housing? Get ready to get much more familiar with them, because they are the absolute bedrock of the ancient Egyptian diet, for rich and poor alike. Mainstream historical fact: bread and beer were so central to life that they weren't just food and drink. They were often used as a form of payment, with laborers and officials receiving daily rations as part of their compensation. Imagine getting paid for your work with a few rough loaves and a jug of thick, low-alcohol brew. Your direct deposit notification would look very different. Making bread was a monumental task. The grain, usually emmer wheat or barley, had to be harvested, threshed, and then ground into flour. This grinding, usually done by women using heavy stone querns, was incredibly laborious. And no matter how careful they were, tiny fragments of the stone would inevitably get mixed into the flour. When the bread was baked, this grit remained. Every single loaf you eat will contain abrasive particles. Your modern teeth, likely pampered with fluoride and regular dental checkups, would be subjected to constant wear and tear. Archaeologists studying Egyptian skeletons consistently find evidence of severe tooth abrasion. Your first few bites of breakfast bread might literally make your teeth ache, a constant, low-grade dental emergency you just have to live with. Forget whitening strips. You'll be lucky if your teeth don't wear down to the gums by the time you're 30. And the beer? Not the bubbly, clear stuff you get from the fridge. Ancient Egyptian beer was more like a thick, nutritious gruel, made by partially baking dough, crumbling it into a vat, adding water and sometimes dates for sweetness, and letting it ferment. It wasn't heavily filtered, so it was often cloudy, perhaps even chunky. It had a lower alcohol content than most modern beers, more for calories and hydration than intoxication, though they certainly had stronger brews for festivals. And crucially, because the fermentation process killed off some pathogens, it was often safer to drink than plain water from the Nile. So, while it might taste strange and have an off-putting texture, imagine trying to chug a warm, gritty smoothie that tastes vaguely of fermented grain. It's probably keeping you alive by preventing waterborne diseases. Your sophisticated palate, used to differentiating between IPAs and lagers, would have to adjust to a single, fundamental beverage. Beyond the bread and beer, the diet was largely vegetarian, supplemented by fish. Onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, cucumbers, lentils, and beans were common vegetables, grown in the fertile soil left by the Nile flood. Fruits like dates, figs, grapes, and pomegranates were available seasonally, providing sweetness and variety. Dates, in particular, were a crucial source of sugar and could be dried for storage. You might find yourself snacking on dried dates constantly, a welcome change from the gritty bread. Protein came primarily from fish caught in the Nile and the irrigation canals. Fishing was a common occupation, using nets, traps, or lines. Fish could be eaten fresh, or more commonly, dried and salted for preservation, especially important given the lack of refrigeration. Meat was a luxury for most commoners, reserved for festivals, religious offerings, or the tables of the elite. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were raised, but killing and butchering them was less frequent. Poultry like ducks and geese were also consumed, often fattened artificially. If you do get a chance to eat meat, it would likely be roasted over an open fire or boiled. Food preparation was simple and dictated by the available technology. Baking was done in clay ovens, either communal ones in villages or individual ones in wealthier homes. Boiling and roasting were done over open fires or using clay braziers. Spices were used, but perhaps not as extensively as in some other ancient cultures, relying more on the natural flavors of the ingredients, enhanced by herbs like parsley or coriander. Honey and dates were the main sweeteners. The challenge wasn't just what to eat, but how to keep it from spoiling. With no refrigeration, food had to be consumed quickly or preserved. Drying, especially fish, dates, and some vegetables, and salting were the primary methods. Grain was stored in granaries, but keeping it safe from pests like rodents and insects was a constant battle. A quirky tidbit: evidence from tomb paintings shows Egyptians storing grain in large, sealed silos and even depicting cats nearby, presumably to help control rodents. Your modern pantry, sealed and climate-controlled, seems like a miracle of food preservation by comparison. Historians still argue whether the nutritional status of the average Egyptian commoner was consistently good, or if it fluctuated greatly depending on the success of the harvest and the political stability of the period. While the staples of bread, beer, vegetables, and fish provided essential calories and some nutrients, deficiencies could arise if the diet wasn't varied enough or if harvests failed. Famine, while perhaps less frequent than in some neighboring regions thanks to the predictable Nile flood, was still a terrifying possibility if the inundation was too low or too high, or if the state failed to manage grain reserves properly. Your access to food, therefore, wasn't just about your ability to work, it was tied to the whims of the river and the efficiency, or corruption, of the state administration. Think about eating every meal without cutlery as you know it. Food was often eaten with the hands, perhaps scooping up stews with pieces of bread. Table manners, while they existed, were different. And the sheer physical effort of preparing food, grinding grain for hours, hauling water, tending fires, pounding herbs, makes grabbing a ready meal from the supermarket freezer feel like an act of magic. So, while the basic components of the Egyptian diet seem recognizable, bread, beer, vegetables, fish, the reality of consuming and preparing them is a far cry from your modern experience. The constant grit in your bread, the thick, lukewarm beer, the limited variety, the reliance on seasonal availability, the lack of refrigeration leading to spoilage, and the sheer labor involved in every meal would be a constant, grinding challenge. Your digestive system, used to pasteurized milk, filtered water, and hygienically prepared food, would be under constant assault. Dining like an Egyptian isn't a culinary adventure, it's a daily exercise in survival, one that your modern body and expectations are ill-equipped to handle. Okay, you've somehow navigated the tricky business of ancient Egyptian dining, chewed your way through gritty bread, sipped your lukewarm, chunky beer, and maybe even sampled some dried fish or a date. Your stomach might be complaining, your teeth definitely are, but you've gotten some calories in. Now what? Unless you plan to spend the rest of your time huddled in that dark, stuffy mud brick house, you're going to need to move. Maybe you need to get to the fields, visit a relative in another village, or perhaps you've been summoned for that delightful corvée labor we discussed. Get ready, because getting around in ancient Egypt wasn't just inconvenient. It was a major undertaking, fraught with peril and requiring immense effort. Forget jumping in your car, hopping on a train, or booking a flight. Your options are limited, slow, and dictated by the natural world. Mainstream historical fact: the single most important mode of transportation in ancient Egypt was the Nile River. It wasn't just a source of water and fertility, it was the superhighway of the civilization, connecting cities, villages, and agricultural lands from the Mediterranean coast all the way south into Nubia. If you needed to travel any significant distance, especially north or south, the river was your best bet. Imagine the Nile as the ancient equivalent of the M1, but instead of speeding cars, you have boats of all shapes and sizes, propelled by wind, current, or sheer human effort. Boats were everywhere. Simple papyrus skiffs, tied together in bundles, were used for short trips, fishing, or navigating shallow waters. For longer journeys and carrying cargo, they used wooden boats, built from acacia wood, as large timber wasn't abundant in Egypt, or sometimes imported cedar. These could range from small vessels for personal travel to massive barges used to transport grain, stone blocks for temples, or even obelisks. The design was often distinctive, with a high prow and stern. Traveling on the Nile involved harnessing the natural forces of the river and the wind. The prevailing wind in Egypt blows from the north, while the Nile flows from south to north. This created a remarkably efficient two-way system. If you wanted to travel south, upstream against the current, you would lower your sail and rely on paddling or poling the boat forward. It was slow, arduous work, fighting against the flow of the river. Think of it like trying to walk up an escalator that's going down, but instead of just standing there, you're actively pushing against it with a stick or rowing with all your might. If you wanted to travel north, downstream with the current, you would raise a large, often square sail. The wind from the north would fill the sail, pushing you against the current, effectively canceling it out and allowing you to glide smoothly downstream. It was a clever system, perfectly adapted to the unique geography and climate of Egypt. Imagine the relief of raising that sail after days of poling upstream, feeling the wind catch it and propel you effortlessly forward. Ah, the ancient equivalent of hitting cruise control. But river travel wasn't without its dangers. Remember those crocodiles and hippos we talked about? They were a very real threat to boats, especially smaller ones, and to anyone who fell overboard or needed to stop near the bank. Sandbanks could shift, stranding vessels. And while the main river was generally navigable, rapids existed in certain areas, particularly the cataracts in the south, which required unloading cargo and hauling boats overland to bypass. Navigating the Nile required skill, knowledge of the river's ever-changing moods, and a healthy dose of caution. Your modern reliance on GPS and well-marked channels is utterly useless here. You're relying on the boatman's knowledge, passed down through generations, and maybe a prayer to Hapi, the god of the Nile. What about land travel? For short distances, like walking to the fields or within a village, you simply walked. Your feet, probably clad in simple sandals, if you were lucky or bare, would be constantly exposed to dust, stones, and potentially sharp objects or thorny plants. For carrying burdens, people often carried them on their heads or shoulders, a skill requiring balance and strength you likely don't possess. Try carrying a heavy water jar on your head for more than 10 feet without wobbling uncontrollably. Yeah, exactly. For longer distances overland, donkeys were the primary mode of transport. They were hardy, could carry heavy loads, and navigate the dusty, uneven terrain. Riding a donkey might sound charmingly rustic, but it's not exactly a comfortable experience, especially for hours on end under the blazing sun. Imagine sitting on a bony animal, bouncing along a rough track, the dust kicked up by its hooves coating you from head to toe. Your idea of a relaxing commute would be severely challenged. Carts existed, often pulled by oxen or donkeys, but they weren't as common for long-distance travel as boats or donkeys, largely due to the lack of well-maintained roads. Indeed, roads as you know them didn't really exist outside of causeways leading to temples or quarries. Most land routes were simply well-worn tracks across the desert or along the edge of the cultivated land. These routes were exposed to the elements, the relentless sun, swirling dust storms, and offered little in the way of shelter or amenities. There were no rest stops, no roadside diners, no places to fill up your water bottle, unless you happened upon a well, which might be guarded or dry. Traveling overland meant carrying everything you needed with you, including food and water, and hoping you didn't encounter trouble. And trouble was a real possibility. Traveling alone or in small groups, especially with valuable goods, made you vulnerable to bandits operating on the fringes of settled areas or in the desert. The state tried to maintain order, but they couldn't patrol every dusty track. Imagine the anxiety of traveling through open country, constantly scanning the horizon for signs of danger, knowing that if you were attacked, there was no police force to call, no security system to rely on. Your safety depended entirely on your companions, your vigilance, and maybe the speed of your donkey. It makes waiting for your bus feel like the safest activity on earth. A quirky tidbit: while land travel was difficult, the Egyptians did manage to move incredibly heavy objects overland, like massive stone statues and obelisks, for vast distances from quarries to temple sites. This was achieved through sheer manpower, using sledges pulled by hundreds or even thousands of laborers, often lubricating the ground in front of the sledge with water or milk. Yes, milk. Imagine organizing that commute. Okay, everyone, grab a rope. And does anyone have any spare milk? We're moving a statue today. Historians still argue whether the extent of official road networks and way stations was more developed than commonly thought, particularly along important trade routes or military paths. While the Nile was primary, it's debated how much infrastructure the state invested in facilitating overland movement beyond major construction projects. Was there a system for providing water or security along certain land routes, or were travelers largely left to fend for themselves once they left the river valley? So, whether you're pulling a boat upstream against the current, bouncing along on a donkey under the scorching sun, or carrying a heavy load on your head across dusty fields, travel in ancient Egypt is physically demanding, slow, and potentially dangerous. Your modern concept of effortless mobility is completely foreign here. Every journey, no matter how short, is a significant undertaking, requiring effort, planning, and a healthy respect for the power of the river and the dangers of the land. You'd be exhausted, dusty, and constantly aware of the risks, longing for the simple comfort of a paved road and a reliable mode of transport that doesn't involve dodging crocodiles or hoping your donkey doesn't decide to take a nap in the middle of nowhere. You've traveled along the Nile, perhaps dodged a hippo or two, and arrived at a slightly larger settlement. As you walk through the dusty lanes, past the mud brick houses and busy workshops, you might notice something you haven't seen much of in the fields or quarries: people sitting, hunched over, focused on delicate work that doesn't involve lifting heavy things or swinging a sickle. You might see someone carefully painting symbols on a piece of pottery, or someone else, perhaps a young boy, practicing drawing complex figures on a smooth flake of limestone. This isn't just art, this is learning. And in a world built on physical labor, the ability to read and write was a superpower, a golden ticket to a life far removed from the backbreaking toil you've just endured. But who got to learn? Not everyone, certainly not the vast majority of farmers and laborers you've seen. Education in ancient Egypt, particularly literacy, was largely reserved for the elite and those destined for administrative roles. It was a privilege, a pathway to power and prestige, not a universal right. If you were born into a farming family, your education consisted of learning how to work the land, how to irrigate, how to harvest, practical skills passed down from parent to child, learned through doing, not from books, or papyri in this case. Your classroom was the field, your teacher your father or mother. Your modern concept of compulsory schooling for all children? Utterly foreign. Most kids, after a brief, playful childhood, if they even had that, were expected to contribute to the household labor from a young age. There was no time or need for reading and writing if your life was spent wrestling with stubborn oxen or hauling water jars. For those few who had the opportunity, education centered around becoming a scribe. Mainstream historical fact: becoming a scribe was one of the primary ways to achieve social mobility in ancient Egypt, offering exemption from manual labor and opening doors to positions in the government, temples, and army administration. Scribal schools were often attached to temples or royal palaces, and they weren't easy. Learning the complex writing system was incredibly difficult. Hieroglyphs, while beautiful and iconic, were not a simple alphabet. They involved thousands of signs representing sounds, objects, and concepts. Mastering them required years of rote memorization and painstaking practice. Imagine trying to learn a system where a single symbol could be a picture of a bird and represent a specific sound and signify a concept like soul. It's enough to make your head spin, especially compared to the relatively straightforward alphabet you learned as a child. Your modern ability to text quickly with predictive text and emojis? Useless. You'd be painstakingly drawing little pictures of birds and reeds for hours just to write a simple sentence. Beyond hieroglyphs, scribes also learned hieratic, a cursive script used for everyday writing on papyrus or ostraca, those limestone flakes or pottery shards used for notes and practice. Hieratic was faster to write than hieroglyphs but still required mastery of the complex science system. Education also included numeracy, essential for managing grain stores, calculating taxes, overseeing labor forces, and administering the vast resources of the state and temples. You'd learn arithmetic, geometry, useful for surveying fields after the flood, and accounting. Imagine doing complex calculations using a system based on units, tens, hundreds, etc., but without the concept of zero as a placeholder, a concept that wouldn't arrive in Egypt for centuries. Your modern calculator would be a baffling piece of magic. The curriculum in scribal schools wasn't just technical. Students copied instructional texts and literary works, which often contained moral lessons and advice on how to behave to succeed in society. A quirky tidbit: many of the surviving ancient Egyptian literary texts we have today are copies made by scribal students as practice exercises. These range from wisdom literature offering cynical advice on how to get ahead by flattering your superiors and being wary of everyone else, to hymns praising the gods or the pharaoh, to fictional stories. So, while learning to write, you'd also be internalizing the values and worldview of the Egyptian elite, learning how to navigate that rigid social hierarchy we discussed earlier. It was indoctrination as much as education, shaping you into a loyal servant of the state and the divine order. Your modern school's emphasis on critical thinking and questioning authority? Not a feature here. Other forms of specialized knowledge were also valued, often passed down through apprenticeship or within specific families or institutions. Priests needed to learn vast amounts of religious texts, rituals, and astronomical knowledge to maintain the calendar and perform complex ceremonies. Doctors, SWNW*, acquired medical knowledge through training and practice, often associated with temples or specific schools. Craftspeople learned their trades, pottery, weaving, metalworking, stone carving, through years of hands-on apprenticeship, mastering techniques that had been perfected over millennia. This practical, vocational knowledge was essential for the functioning of society, but it wasn't seen as the same kind of prestigious education as literacy. Historians still argue whether the extent of literacy in ancient Egypt was higher than previously thought, with some evidence suggesting that basic reading and writing skills might have been more widespread among certain segments of the population, like skilled craftsmen or lower-level officials, than the traditional view of a tiny literate elite. While full mastery of the scribal arts remained exclusive, perhaps a functional level of literacy was more common. However, even if this is true, it was still a tiny fraction compared to modern literacy rates. Your modern knowledge base, history, science, technology, literature, social studies, is completely irrelevant here. Your ability to understand complex algorithms, analyze political systems, or appreciate Shakespeare would earn you nothing but blank stares. The knowledge that matters here is practical: how to farm, how to build, how to heal with herbs, and administrative/religious, how to read and write, how to calculate, how to appease the gods. You are intellectually adrift in a world where your skills are useless, and the knowledge you need to survive is locked behind a language barrier and social walls. Trying to learn the ropes now, as a bewildered adult, would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. You'd be starting from scratch, trying to master a complex script and a foreign language while also struggling with basic survival. There are no Rosetta Stone apps here, no friendly tutors offering crash courses in hieratic. You are functionally illiterate and enumerate in the Egyptian context, your modern education a heavy, useless burden in a world that values entirely different forms of intelligence and skill. The path to a better life through learning is firmly closed to you. You've spent your days struggling with the heat, the dust, the back-breaking labor, and the sheer impossibility of just being in this ancient world. You've faced down potential dysentery, dodged imaginary crocodiles, and realized your modern education is about as useful as a chocolate teapot here. Your body aches, your stomach rumbles, and your spirit is probably feeling a little crushed. Is there any respite? Any moment of joy or relaxation in this relentless cycle of survival? You might be longing for a night off, a chance to forget your troubles and just have some fun. Well, even in ancient Egypt, people weren't always working. They found ways to entertain themselves, to socialize, and to enjoy moments of leisure, even if it looked very different from your idea of a good time. After a long day in the fields or workshops, as the sun dips towards the horizon and the air begins to cool slightly, the rhythm of life would shift. The intensity of labor might lessen, allowing for some relaxation and social interaction. Leisure time wasn't a structured block in the same way we think of weekends or evenings off. It was more woven into the fabric of daily life, often centered around family, community, and religious festivals. For the common folk, simple pleasures were key. Storytelling was undoubtedly popular, passing down myths, legends, historical tales, and perhaps even juicy gossip about the neighbors or the local officials. Imagine gathering with your family or friends in the cool evening air outside your mud brick house, listening to tales of the gods, the pharaohs, or perhaps just humorous anecdotes about village life. There was no Netflix or YouTube, so your entertainment came from human connection and oral tradition. Remember those scribal students copying literature? Some of those stories, like the Tale of Sinew or the Shipwrecked Sailor, were not just educational exercises. They were popular narratives enjoyed for their adventure and wisdom. You might hear a version of these tales recounted around a fire, perhaps embellished by the storyteller. Music and dance were also integral parts of Egyptian life, from religious ceremonies to private parties. Simple instruments like harps, lutes, flutes, clarinets, and percussion instruments like drums and sistra, a rattle-like instrument, were used. You might hear someone playing a simple tune on a flute in the fields, or a more organized ensemble performing at a feast or festival. Dancing could range from formal, ritualistic movements in temples to more lively, acrobatic performances at celebrations. Imagine trying to join in on a dance you've never seen before, your movements awkward and out of sync with the ancient rhythm. You'd probably stick to tapping your foot awkwardly in the corner. Games provided another form of entertainment. Children played with simple toys like dolls, wooden animals, or balls. Adults also enjoyed board games. Mainstream historical fact: one of the most popular board games in ancient Egypt was Senet, a game of strategy and chance played on a board with 30 squares. Boards have been found in tombs ranging from humble burials to that of Tutankhamun, showing its widespread appeal across social classes. The rules are still debated by scholars today, but it involved moving pieces along the board, trying to be the first to bear them off, perhaps representing the journey through the afterlife. Imagine sitting down for a game of Senet, trying to figure out the rules from observing others, hoping you don't accidentally make a move that's considered deeply offensive to the gods or your opponent. Checkmate! Wait, did I just lose my soul? Physical activities and sports were also part of the leisure landscape. Wrestling, boxing, and various forms of athletic contests were practiced, sometimes depicted in tomb paintings. Swimming in the Nile, despite the dangers, was also enjoyed, especially by children. Hunting and fishing, while often necessary for survival, could also be recreational pursuits for the elite, who are often shown in tomb art hunting birds in the marshes with throwing sticks or fishing with spears from papyrus boats. You, with your likely lack of hunting skills and fear of crocodiles, would probably stick to watching the kids splash nervously near the bank. Religious festivals offered significant breaks from the daily routine for everyone. These were often lively public events involving processions, music, dancing, and feasting, celebrating the gods and the cycles of the year. The Opet festival, for example, involved a procession of the cult statues of Ammonius, Mut, and Khonsu from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple, accompanied by singing, dancing, and general merriment. These festivals provided opportunities for people to gather, socialize, and participate in communal religious experiences, reinforcing social bonds and providing a sense of shared identity. Imagine the sheer joy and chaos of a major festival day, a rare burst of color, sound, and collective celebration in a life often marked by hardship and routine. Your modern concept of a public holiday, perhaps spent at a barbecue or watching fireworks, doesn't quite capture the deep religious and social significance of these ancient celebrations. For the elite, leisure activities were more elaborate and often involved feasting, banquets, and private entertainment. Wealthy Egyptians hosted parties with abundant food, wine. Yes, they made wine from grapes, though beer was still the staple, music played by professional musicians, and performances by dancers and acrobats. These events were important social occasions, allowing the elite to display their wealth and status and strengthen their connections. Imagine being invited to such a feast, the richness of the food, the flow of wine, the skilled performers, a world away from the gritty bread and simple fare of the commoner. It would be a dazzling, overwhelming experience, highlighting the vast gulf between the social classes. A quirky tidbit: pets were very popular in ancient Egypt, and keeping animals for companionship was a form of leisure and affection. Cats were particularly cherished. Remember their association with Badat? But dogs, monkeys, and even exotic animals like falcons were kept as pets, especially by the elite. You might see a sleek cat lounging in a sunny spot or a small dog trotting alongside its owner. Your desire to pet a cute animal might finally be fulfilled. Just be sure it's not a sacred ibis or a crocodile in disguise. Historians still argue whether the amount of leisure time available to the average Egyptian commoner was significant, or if their lives were almost entirely consumed by labor. While festivals and religious observances provided structured breaks, the demanding nature of agriculture and state labor suggests that genuine free time for personal pursuits might have been limited, especially during peak seasons like harvest or flood. Were they simply exhausted after work, or did they regularly engage in games, music, and storytelling? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, with moments of leisure snatched in the evenings or during less demanding times of the year, centered around simple, accessible activities. So, while ancient Egypt wasn't all work and no play, your opportunities for leisure would be vastly different and perhaps less frequent than you're used to. Your idea of relaxation, scrolling through social media, watching TV, going to a movie, is impossible. Your entertainment would come from human interaction, simple games, music, dance, and the occasional vibrant burst of a religious festival. You wouldn't have the luxury of abundant free time or easy access to diverse forms of entertainment. Finding moments of joy and distraction in this challenging world would require embracing the simple pleasures and participating in the communal life of the village, a stark contrast to the solitary, screen-based leisure many of us experience today. Okay, so you've had a moment to relax, maybe watch some kids play Senet, or listen to someone struggle through a tune on a flute. You've seen that even in this relentless ancient world, there are pockets of leisure, moments to connect with others or enjoy simple pleasures. But don't get too comfortable. Because while daily life might have its rhythms of work and rest, the wider world of ancient Egypt wasn't always peaceful. Bordered by the vast, unpredictable desert and interacting with neighboring kingdoms and tribes, conflict was a recurring reality. And you, as a potential able-bodied adult, even if your body feels like it's failing you, might find yourself unexpectedly thrust into the military machine. Forget the idea of a standing army of professional soldiers like you might see in a modern nation. While the pharaoh did have a core force of career soldiers and elite units, the bulk of the army was often raised through conscription, drawing men from the general population, yes, those very farmers and laborers you've been struggling alongside. If the state needed soldiers for a campaign, a decree could go out, and you, if you were deemed fit, could be called up for service. Your plans for mastering the art of making gritty bread? Put on hold. Your aspirations of becoming a master weaver? Also on hold. You've got a new job now, soldier. Imagine being pulled away from your village, your family, your familiar fields, and sent off to join a company of men you've never met. Training would be rudimentary and harsh. You'd learn to march in formation under the scorching sun, carrying heavy equipment. You'd be taught how to handle basic weapons, a simple spear, maybe a shield made of wood or hide, perhaps a battle axe or a mace if you were lucky or assigned to a specific role. Archery was a highly valued skill, and you might be trained with a composite bow, a powerful weapon that required significant strength and practice to use effectively. There were no firing ranges or simulations. Your training was physical, repetitive, and designed to turn farmers into fighting units as quickly as possible. Imagine trying to hold a heavy shield and spear in the Egyptian heat for hours, your muscles screaming in protest, while an experienced drill sergeant yells orders at you in a language you barely understand. Your concept of boot camp seems positively luxurious by comparison. The Egyptian army was organized into divisions or companies, often named after major gods. You'd live in barracks, sharing cramped quarters with your fellow soldiers, eating standard army rations, more gritty bread and beer, naturally, perhaps with some dried meat or fish for protein. Discipline was strict, enforced by officers who might have risen through the ranks based on merit or connections. Life was tough, monotonous training punctuated by periods of intense activity during campaigns. Mainstream historical fact: the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BC, saw the Egyptian military reach its peak, becoming a formidable force that campaigned extensively in the Levant, modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Nubia, modern-day Sudan, establishing a vast empire. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses II led large armies into battle, fighting against powerful enemies like the Mitanni and the Hittites, as well as suppressing rebellions and conducting raids. So, depending on when you landed, you might be part of an army of conquest, defending Egypt's borders, or putting down an internal revolt. Campaigns meant long, arduous marches across deserts or through foreign lands. You'd carry your own supplies, face unpredictable terrain, and constantly be on alert for enemy forces. Battles were brutal, close-quarters affairs. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of other men, facing a charging enemy line, the air filled with the sound of war cries, the clash of weapons, and the thud of bodies. Your modern sensibilities about personal space and nonviolence would be utterly useless. Survival depended on fighting as a unit, following orders, and inflicting as much damage on the enemy as possible while trying to avoid their blows. There was no concept of fair fight or Geneva Conventions here. The enemies you might face varied depending on the era. In the south, you could be fighting Nubian tribes, skilled archers who sometimes served as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. To the west, Libyan tribes often raided the Delta region, leading to defensive campaigns. In the northeast, the wealthier, more complex states of the Levant and the Near East posed significant challenges, particularly the Hittite Empire, which clashed with Egypt for control of Syria in famous battles like Kadesh. Facing chariots, the ancient equivalent of tanks, would be a terrifying experience if you were just a foot soldier armed with a spear. A quirky tidbit: Egyptian chariots were light, two-wheeled vehicles pulled by two horses, carrying a driver and a warrior, often an archer. They were used for rapid maneuverability on the battlefield, scouting, and breaking enemy formations, not for direct charging into infantry lines like heavier chariots used elsewhere. Still, seeing a line of these bearing down on you would likely make you want to find a very large rock to hide behind. Historians still argue whether the composition of the Egyptian army remained primarily Egyptian or if foreign mercenaries, particularly Nubians, Libyans, and later, Sea Peoples and Greeks, played an increasingly dominant role over time, especially in the later periods. Did the core Egyptian conscript force remain the backbone, or did the pharaohs rely more and more on hired fighters? This debate affects our understanding of military effectiveness and social structure within the army. Even if you survived a battle, life wasn't easy. Wounds were common, and while Egyptian medicine was advanced for its time, battlefield injuries were often catastrophic. Infection was a constant threat. There was no military hospital with sterile equipment. You'd be treated by army physicians using the methods we discussed earlier, perhaps honey on a wound, or a poultice of questionable ingredients. Your chances of recovering from a serious injury would be slim. If you were permanently disabled, your prospects upon returning home would be grim, with little state support beyond perhaps your family or village. Military service could offer opportunities for advancement, particularly for those who proved themselves brave and capable. Successful soldiers could gain prestige, land, and even rise into the officer class or the administrative bureaucracy. But for the average conscripted farmer, it was more likely a period of intense hardship, danger, and separation from home, with the hope of simply surviving and returning to their previous life. So, just when you thought you were getting used to the routine of civilian hardship, you might find yourself marching off to war, facing enemies you don't understand in battles you are completely unprepared for. Your modern aversion to violence and your lack of physical combat training would make you a liability, both to yourself and your unit. The harsh realities of ancient Egyptian warfare, the brutal training, the constant danger, and the lack of modern medical care mean that even if you weren't killed in battle, simply enduring military service would be another immense challenge you are almost certainly not equipped to handle. Okay, so you've faced the heat, the hunger, the backbreaking work, the terrifying wildlife, the rigid social system, the brutal justice, and the very real possibility of being conscripted into a dangerous army. You've realized that surviving even a day in ancient Egypt is a monumental, almost impossible task for your modern, pampered self. Life here is undeniably hard, often short, and fraught with peril. But for the ancient Egyptians, this earthly existence, no matter how challenging, was seen as just one part of a much longer journey. Their focus wasn't solely on enduring the hardships of this life. It was profoundly shaped by their beliefs about what came after. And as your hypothetical, likely doomed, day in ancient Egypt draws to a close, you might find yourself contemplating the ancient Egyptian perspective on death and the afterlife, a concept that permeated their culture more deeply than almost any other. Forget the modern finality of death, or the diverse and often uncertain beliefs about what happens next. For ancient Egyptians, death wasn't an end, but a transition. It was the passage from the physical world into the duat, the underworld, and hopefully, if you played your cards right, or rather, if the gods smiled upon you and your preparations were sufficient, into the eternal paradise of the field of reeds. This belief in a vibrant, continuing existence after death was not some abstract philosophical concept. It was a tangible reality they prepared for throughout their lives. You see evidence of this everywhere, in the elaborate tombs, the funerary texts, the mummified bodies, and the objects placed with the deceased. Your modern discomfort with discussing death, or the common practice of cremation, would be utterly baffling to them. To destroy the body was to potentially destroy the chance of eternal life. The core of their afterlife belief revolved around preserving the individual's essence. They believed each person had several spiritual components that needed to survive and function after death. There was the Ka, often translated as life force or double, which needed sustenance and resided in the tomb, able to travel between the tomb and the afterlife. And there was the Ba, often depicted as a human-headed bird, representing the personality or soul, which could travel freely between the underworld and the world of the living, visiting loved ones and revisiting favorite places. To ensure the survival of the Ka and the Ba, the physical body had to be preserved, and the tomb needed to provide a dwelling place and sustenance. This is where the most famous Egyptian practice comes in. Mainstream historical fact: mummification was the complex and lengthy process developed by the ancient Egyptians to preserve the body after death, believing it was essential for the survival of the Ka and Ba in the afterlife. This wasn't done for everyone throughout all periods, but it was the ideal, particularly for those who could afford it. The process involved removing the internal organs, except the heart, drying the body using natron salt, anointing it with oils and resins, and wrapping it in layers of linen bandages, often with protective amulets placed between the layers. The removed organs were also preserved separately in canopic jars, each guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus. Imagine the sheer smell and messy reality of this process, a far cry from the clean, solemn depictions you might see. Your modern squeamishness about bodily fluids and decay would make you an absolute disaster as a mummification assistant. Forget surgical masks. You need a hazmat suit and a very strong stomach. Once the body was prepared and placed in its sarcophagus within the tomb, the journey through the underworld, the duat, began. This was a perilous realm filled with challenges, obstacles, and terrifying demons. Funerary texts like the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions, not a single book every Egyptian owned, were placed in tombs to guide the deceased safely through this journey, providing passwords to bypass gates, spells to ward off dangers, and instructions on how to navigate the trials ahead. Think of it as the ancient Egyptian version of a travel guide and phrasebook for the land of the dead, except the stakes are eternal salvation or utter annihilation. The most crucial moment in the afterlife journey was the judgment before Osiris, the god of the underworld. This took place in the Hall of Two Truths. Here, the deceased would make a negative confession, proclaiming their innocence of a long list of sins. I have not killed, I have not stolen, I have not lied, etc. Then came the pivotal moment, the weighing of the heart ceremony. The heart, believed to be the seat of the individual's consciousness and morality, was placed on one side of a scale, balanced against the feather of Ma'at on the other. Ma'at, remember, is the concept of truth, justice, and cosmic order. A quirky tidbit: if the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, the scales would tip, and the heart would be devoured by Ammit, a terrifying creature with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, resulting in the deceased's complete obliteration, the ultimate, terrifying end for an ancient Egyptian. If the heart balanced with the feather, the deceased was deemed worthy and allowed to pass into the field of reeds. Historians still argue whether the concept of the afterlife and the requirements for achieving it remained consistent throughout the vast span of Egyptian history, or if beliefs and practices evolved significantly over time, influenced by changing religious thought and political structures. Was the judgment process always the same? Did the emphasis on magic versus righteous living shift? Did the accessibility of elaborate burial practices change for commoners? These are questions still debated based on the surviving evidence. If you passed the test, the field of reeds awaited. This wasn't some ethereal, inactive paradise. It was envisioned as an idealized version of Egypt itself: fertile fields, abundant harvests, and pleasant activities like farming, feasting, and spending time with loved ones, but without the hardship, pain, or death of earthly life. Imagine an eternal retirement community where the Nile always floods perfectly, the grain grows effortlessly, and there are no crocodiles or annoying overseers. You would live forever in this idyllic landscape, a perfect, unchanging existence. This was the ultimate goal, the reward for a life lived in accordance with Ma'at and successful navigation of the underworld. So, as your time in this harsh, ancient world hypothetically concludes, perhaps with you succumbing to disease, injury, or simply the sheer exhaustion of it all, your fate, in the Egyptian view, would depend on your heart's weight. Would your modern anxieties, your occasional fibs to get out of social events, your moments of impatience, weigh down your heart against the feather of Ma'at? Would Ammit be waiting? Or would you somehow, against all odds, be deemed worthy of an eternity spent harvesting perfect, grit-free grain in the field of reeds? It's a final, terrifying gamble in a world that offered very few certainties. And with that thought, the harsh light of the ancient Egyptian sun begins to fade. The sounds of the village soften, the dust motes dancing in the last rays of light settle. The weight of the heat, the hunger, the constant fear of the unknown, the sheer physical exhaustion, it all begins to lift. You can feel the tension draining from your shoulders, the ache receding from your muscles. The smells of the Nile, the livestock, the cooking fires, they become fainter, less overwhelming. You're no longer standing in that dusty, bustling ancient village, feeling utterly out of place. You're back where you started, safe and sound, in your own comfortable space. The images of mud-brick houses, linen-clad figures, and the vast, brown expanse of the Nile are just pictures in your mind now, echoes of a world that existed millennia ago, a world you are fundamentally unsuited for. The dangers, the diseases, the predators, the unforgiving law, the crushing labor, they were real for the people who lived there. But for you, they were just a glimpse, a fleeting, intense experience from the safety of your modern life. You wouldn't last a day, not really. But spending this time imagining it, walking in their footsteps for just a little while, perhaps gives you a deeper appreciation for the resilience of those who did, who built a civilization that lasted for thousands of years against incredible odds. So, take a deep breath. Let the last remnants of ancient Egypt drift away. The dust has settled, the sun has set on our journey. You're home. It's time to rest. Close your eyes now. Drift off. Sweet dreams.